I thought these glasses were a gift, a way to filter the chaos of the city. But then the interface flickered. Above a stranger's head, it didn't say commuter. It said, Demon, Level 5. Feeding on fear. I ripped them off, but I was too late. I've seen what's under their skin, and now, my own reflection has a new label, Prophet. To be destroyed. And something with hooves is walking down my hallway. Arthur always preferred the rhythmic weeping of the sky to the hollow, suffocating silence of his vacant apartment. On this particular Tuesday, the 10th of November, the downpour clawed at the windowpane with a relentless, metronomic persistence that seemed to sync with the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. The gray light of the late afternoon filtered through the glass, casting long, sickly shadows across the worn floorboards that smelled faintly of lemon wax and old, damp dust. He stood in the center of the room, a solitary figure draped in the dimness, listening to the house settle with its usual repertoire of wooden groans and cooling pipes. Resting upon the scarred mahogany of his desk was a black, matte box that seemed to drink in what little light remained in the room. It bore no brand name, no flashy logos, and no serial numbers. It was merely a void of smooth, light-absorbing cardboard that felt unnaturally cold to his touch. Arthur traced the perimeter of the lid with his index finger, savoring the subtle, grainy texture of the premium packaging against his skin. The silence of the room amplified the dry friction of his finger against the box, a sound that felt unnecessarily loud and intimate in the stillness of the 10th of November. When he finally lifted the lid, the air in the apartment seemed to shift with a faint, pressurized hiss, a sound reminiscent of a long-held, humid sigh escaping from a tomb. The vacuum seal resisted for a heartbeat before yielding, releasing the sharp, metallic scent of sterile plastic and ozone into the stagnant air. Inside, cradled within a custom-cut nest of charcoal-colored foam, lay the glasses. They were heavy, their frames thick and masculine, crafted from a material that felt more like polished bone or dense obsidian than mere acetate. He lifted the device with trembling fingers, noting the way the lenses caught the dying light, refracting it into oily, violet patterns that danced across his palms like spilled fuel. The stems were unusually wide, housing the complex circuitry that promised to bridge the gap between his lonely reality and the digital ether. There was a certain weight to them, an architectural solidity that suggested importance, permanence, and a hidden, slumbering power. He ran his thumb over the bridge of the frames, feeling the microscopic seams where the hardware integrated into the elegant, dark design. As Arthur slid the frames over his ears, a low, vibrating hum resonated deep within the base of his skull, vibrating against his jawline. This was not a sound delivered through the air, but a visceral resonance born of bone conduction, bypassing his eardrums to vibrate directly against his consciousness. A pleasant, feminine voice, scrubbed of all human warmth and inflection, bloomed inside his head, whispering the word calibration. The sensation was intrusive yet oddly comforting, a metallic vibration that synchronized with the frantic, uneven beating of his own heart. A sudden web of translucent, milk-white threads erupted before his eyes, weaving an intricate grid that draped over the physical world like a spider's web. For a fleeting second, the entire room was mapped out in a skeletal blueprint of light, marking the geometry of his existence with surgical, cold precision. The light was clinical and sharp, turning his familiar surroundings into a digitized laboratory where everything was measured, weighed, and accounted for. He watched, breathless, as the glowing filaments settled into the corners of the room, tethering his reality to a hidden, electronic infrastructure. The interface began to populate his field of vision with floating markers that flickered and pulsed like dying stars. His old, sagging sofa was suddenly tagged with a hovering label that read furniture, 70% wear. Beside it, the ceramic mug he had abandoned an hour ago glowed with a soft, pulsing blue hue, accompanied by the scrolling text, liquid, temperature 20 degrees Celsius. The accuracy was intoxicating, turning his cluttered living space into a catalog of data points that left no room for the ambiguity of shadows or the mystery of the dark. A thin, satisfied smile touched Arthur's lips as he realized the oppressive silence of his home had been replaced by a quiet, rhythmic digital hum. The loneliness that usually sat like a heavy, cold stone in his chest began to dissipate, eclipsed by the comforting, constant presence of the data stream. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant patter of the rain now felt like a component of a larger, logical system that he could finally control. He was no longer a man alone in a dark room. He was the central node of a perfectly ordered universe, insulated by a layer of silicon and light. He crossed the room and approached the window, his movements feeling smoother and more intentional through the filtered lenses. Beyond the veil of the storm, the glasses identified the passing silhouettes of vehicles, highlighting their speeds and projected routes in vibrant, neon arcs that cut through the gray rain. The chaotic, rain-slick street was transformed into a predictable flow of vectors and trajectories, a dance of machines that he could now quantify and understand. The world outside looked comprehensible, structured, and for the first time in many years, entirely safe. By the time the sun began its ascent on the third morning, Arthur found the prospect of facing the world without the device utterly unthinkable. The glasses had ceased to be a mere accessory and had instead become a vital, crystalline filter that sieved the chaotic debris of reality into a palatable, structured stream of data. He sat at the edge of his bed, the sheets tangled around his legs like pale, restless snakes, and felt a strange, hollow ache in the bridge of his nose until the familiar weight of the frames was restored. The moment the stems slid over his ears, the silent, oppressive vacuum of the room was punctured by that low-frequency hum, a sound that felt like the purr of a predatory cat vibrating against his skull. It was a comforting intrusion, a digital umbilical cord that tethered his drifting consciousness to a world that finally made sense. Stepping out of the threshold of his apartment building was no longer an act of endurance, but an exercise in observation. The morning city, which had spent years assaulting his senses with its jagged edges and unpredictable cacophony, was now rendered as a serene, architectural diagram. As he descended the concrete steps, the glasses immediately began their silent work, muting the world's harshness with an invisible layer of velvet. The screeching of a garbage truck's brakes 3 blocks away was caught by the internal processors and neutralized, reaching Arthur's mind as nothing more than a soft, rhythmic hiss, like the sound of steam escaping a distant kettle. He watched the city wake up through lenses that prioritized logic over chaos, feeling a sense of godlike detachment from the sprawling, messy life unfolding around him. The sidewalk was a slick ribbon of dark asphalt, reflecting the overcast sky in shimmering, slate-gray pools that Arthur avoided with calculated precision. Every few steps, his boots made a wet, sucking sound against the waterlogged pavement, a sound that the glasses meticulously isolated from the broader ambient noise of the morning. He walked with his head held high, his eyes darting from object to object, drinking in the stream of labels that bloomed in the air like ghostly flowers. A wooden bench, soaked by the previous night's rain, was tagged with oak wood, high moisture content, while a rusted lamppost nearby was identified by the words iron alloy, advanced oxidation. There was a profound, almost religious peace in seeing the hidden essence of things laid bare, in knowing that nothing was merely a shape or a shadow, but a collection of defined parameters. As he moved deeper into the commercial heart of the city, the human element began to thicken, yet even this was sanitized by the technology. The frantic, overlapping conversations of commuters, the sharp clatter of heels on pavement, and the distant, muffled shouting of street vendors were all woven together into a single, monotonous drone. It was a sound not unlike the white noise of a large, industrial fan or the steady, distant thrum of an airplane engine in mid-flight. To Arthur, the people around him were no longer sources of anxiety or unpredictable social variables, they were merely moving obstacles with predictable trajectories and basic biological signatures. He navigated the sea of bodies with a grace he had never before possessed, his path illuminated by shifting, geometric projections that whispered of efficiency and safety. By Thursday evening, the air had grown heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of wet stone as the sun began to dip behind the jagged silhouette of the skyscrapers. Arthur was making his way home, his legs weary but his mind still energized by the constant, flickering feed of information. The city was bathed in a bruised purple light, and the shadows in the alleyways seemed to stretch and yawn like living things, but Arthur remained insulated within his digital cocoon. He reached a major intersection where the traffic was a stagnant river of steel and glass, the red glow of brake lights reflecting off his lenses in rhythmic, bloody pulses. He stopped at the edge of the curb, waiting for the signal to change, his ears filled with the soothing, synthesized hush of the glass's noise cancellation. It was then that he felt a presence materialize beside him, a weight in the air that seemed to press against the side of his body. A woman, burdened by the immense weight of 2 overflowing grocery bags, shuffled to a halt just inches from him. He could hear the sound of her breathing, a heavy, wet labor that rattled deep within her chest, punctuated by the occasional, sharp whistle of air through her nostrils. The smell of her damp, woolen coat, a cloying scent of wet sheep and stale tobacco, drifted toward him, cutting through the sterile atmosphere the glasses usually maintained. Arthur's gaze drifted toward her, and the device responded with its characteristic, internal click, a sound like a tiny, metallic needle dropping onto a glass record. The interface flared to life, casting a pale, greenish light across his field of vision as it attempted to categorize the newcomer. Above the woman's head, a rectangular box materialized, but the text within it was unstable, shivering with a strange, frantic energy. The letters seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made Arthur's teeth ache, their outlines blurring and sharpening in a way that defied the physical properties of light. Biological object, the label read, followed by the word fatigue. But then, the font changed, the letters elongating and drooping like melting wax, or perhaps like ink being dripped into a bowl of stagnant water. They reformed into a word that sent a sudden, unexplained jolt of electricity down Arthur's spine: grief. He blinked, his eyelids scraping against his dry eyeballs with a sound like sandpaper on wood. The word grief hung there for a heartbeat longer, a dark, weeping stain on the fabric of his reality that felt infinitely more real than the streetlights or the cars. It wasn't just a label, it was an intrusion, a glimpse into a depth of human experience that the glasses were supposed to filter out. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the text vanished in a flurry of digital static. The interface reset itself with a sharp, electronic chirp, and the standard, clinical parameters returned, listing her age, height, and heart rate in a cold, white font. The woman remained standing there, her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the ground, seemingly unaware of the glitch that had just exposed her soul. A thin, piercing whine began to oscillate behind Arthur's ears, a sound so high-pitched it felt like a silver wire being drawn through his brain. It was a mosquito-like buzz that grew in intensity until it drowned out the muffled city noise, a warning signal from the very hardware he trusted. He reached up, his fingers trembling as he touched his temples, and he recoiled in a sudden, sharp shock of heat. The duets of the glasses were no longer cool and metallic, they were burning, pulsing with a warmth that felt disturbingly organic. It was a rhythmic heat, a slow, heavy throb that mimicked the flow of blood through a vein, as if the device were no longer powered by a battery, but by some dark, internal circulation of fluid. Arthur stood frozen on the curb, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like tearing silk in the silence of his head. The heat from the frame seeped into his skin, a deep, invasive warmth that seemed to search for the bone beneath the flesh. He tried to rationalize the sensation, telling himself that the processors were simply overtaxed by the density of the evening crowd, that the cooling systems were failing under the strain of 1,000 simultaneous calculations. It was a hardware malfunction, a simple, logical error in a complex system. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against the frames, trying to push the heat away, trying to ignore the way the bone conduction hum had turned into a low, guttural growl. When he finally opened his eyes, the pedestrian signal had turned green, casting a harsh, emerald glow over the wet street. The woman with the grocery bags was already halfway across the road, her heavy, shuffling footsteps echoing with a dull, hollow thud that the glasses no longer bothered to suppress. Arthur watched her go, his vision swimming with strange, iridescent afterimages that looked like oily smears on a lens. He forced himself to step forward, his legs feeling heavy and disconnected, like those of a marionette being piloted by a clumsy hand. The heat in the frames began to subside, fading back into a dull, lingering warmth, but the high-pitched whine remained, a constant, nagging reminder of the glitch. He walked the remaining blocks to his apartment with a sense of mounting urgency, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage of bone. Every flicker of the streetlights, every shadow that crossed his path, seemed to trigger a new wave of data that felt increasingly alien and distorted. He refused to look at the people passing him, terrified of what words might bloom over their heads, terrified of seeing the ink-like stains of their inner lives. He focused only on the path home, on the familiar, geometric lines of his building that promised a return to the structured safety of his own four walls. He told himself he would take the glasses off as soon as he crossed the threshold, that he would let them cool down and restart the system in the morning. But as he reached his front door and fumbled for his keys, the sound of the locks turning felt unnecessarily loud, a series of metallic clacks that echoed through his entire skeleton. The silence of the hallway was thick and suffocating, a heavy blanket that muffled his movements as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He stood in the darkness for a long moment, the only sound the frantic, wet thumping of his own heart and the lingering, ghostly hum of the device. He reached up to remove the frames, his fingers brushing against the still warm material, but he hesitated. The thought of the absolute, unmapped darkness that awaited him on the other side of the lenses was suddenly more terrifying than the heat or the glitches. He left them on, leaning his forehead against the cold wood of the door, as the high-pitched whine in his ears slowly evolved into something that sounded like a distant, rhythmic chanting. Friday arrived with a heavy, leaden sky that seemed to press the very breath out of the city, forcing Arthur to seek refuge in the subterranean veins of the metropolitan transit system. As he descended the concrete stairs, the air underwent a thick, stagnant transformation, losing the crisp bite of the autumn rain and replacing it with the suffocating scent of scorched rubber and ancient, pulverized dust. Each step downward felt like a transition into a different layer of existence, where the light of the sun was replaced by the flickering, sickly yellow hum of recessed fluorescent tubes. The walls of the station were lined with tiles that had once been white but were now stained the color of old teeth, mapped with 1,000 hairline fractures that resembled the delicate veins in a cadaver's hand. Arthur kept his head low, his boots clicking against the grit-covered floor, a sound that felt isolated and sharp in the heavy, humid atmosphere of the tunnel. The platform was a sea of shifting, restless bodies, a chaotic tapestry of humanity that usually would have sent a surge of cortisol through Arthur's veins. However, the glasses acted as his silent sentinel, filtering the world into a manageable, muted simulation of reality. The thunderous approach of an incoming train, a sound that should have been a deafening, metallic shriek echoing through the concrete vault, was processed and discarded by the device's internal dampeners. What remained was a low, rhythmic vibration that Arthur felt primarily through the soles of his shoes and the bones of his shins, a subterranean heartbeat that pulsed with the regularity of a sleeping titan. He leaned his shoulder against a cold, iron-girded pillar, feeling the subtle tremor of the earth beneath him as the air began to push forward in a warm, electric draft. With the world's volume turned down to a gentle hiss, Arthur began to scan the crowd with a lazy, almost detached curiosity, watching the labels bloom over the heads of his fellow passengers. To his left, a student was tagged as biological entity, 19 years old, elevated stress, while to his right, an office clerk stood enveloped in a gray haze of boredom and sleep deprivation. Further down the platform, a tourist clutched a map with white-knuckled intensity, marked by the glasses as confused, seeking navigation. These were safe, mundane descriptors that reaffirmed Arthur's belief in the orderly nature of his new perception, turning the frightening unpredictability of the crowd into a series of solved equations. He found himself slipping into a trance-like state, lulled by the steady flow of data and the rhythmic, dampened thrum of the underground environment. His wandering gaze eventually settled on a figure standing at the very edge of the yellow safety line, a man draped in a long, beige trench coat that looked as though it were fashioned from dried, withered leaves. The man remained perfectly, unnervingly still, an island of absolute stasis in a river of rushing commuters who instinctively veered around him as if he were a jagged rock in a stream. While others shifted their weight, checked their watches, or adjusted their bags, this figure did not so much as blink, his posture rigid and his hands hidden deep within the voluminous pockets of his coat. The fabric of the garment seemed to absorb the dim light of the station, casting no reflection and creating a silhouette that felt strangely detached from the perspective of the surrounding space. As Arthur's focus tightened on the stationary man, the internal hum of the glasses underwent a sudden, violent shift, transitioning from a smooth purr to a jagged, discordant whine. The interface, usually so fluid and transparent, began to flicker with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, casting a crimson strobe across his retinas that felt like a series of physical blows. In his ears, delivered through the bone conduction stems with terrifying clarity, erupted a sound that made his entire skeleton recoil, the sharp, dry crack of a thick bone being snapped in two. It was a visceral, tactile noise, followed by the wet, splintering sound of marrow being exposed to the air, a sound that seemed to echo inside his very brain. Simultaneously, a label materialized above the man in the beige coat, burning with a jagged, unstable light that read, "Demon, Level 5. The words didn't just hover, they seemed to bleed into the air, the crimson text vibrating with such force that it left trailing afterimages in Arthur's vision. Every muscle in his body locked into a state of primal terror, his fingers curling into tight, painful claws against the cold iron of the pillar. His heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, a sound like a panicked bird trapped in a hollow wooden box, and he felt the sudden, icy slide of sweat down the center of his spine. The air in the station suddenly felt devoid of oxygen, a thin and metallic void that scorched his lungs as he struggled to draw a single, meaningful breath. The world outside the lenses began to warp and stretch, the gray concrete of the platform seemingly liquefying under the weight of that singular, terrifying word. In a fit of desperate, unthinking panic, Arthur reached up and tore the glasses from his face, the plastic stems scraping painfully against his temples as he wrenched them away. The transition was a violent assault on his senses, the roar of the station returned with the force of a physical explosion, the screeching of the train's brakes and the thunderous chatter of the crowd crashing over him like a tidal wave. He stood there, panting, his vision blurry and unaugmented, squinting at the men in the beige trench coat through the natural, hazy light of the tunnel. Before him stood nothing more than a tired, middle-aged commuter with deep, dark bags under his eyes and a slightly frayed collar, a man who looked as though he had spent 40 years being ground down by the slow, relentless machinery of the city. There was no red light, no horrific label, and no sense of impending doom, only the mundane exhaustion of a Friday evening. Arthur leaned his head against the pillar, his forehead coming into contact with the cold, gritty metal as he exhaled a long, shaky breath that tasted of iron and dust. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the image of the crimson text out of his mind, telling himself over and over that it was a bug, a catastrophic failure of the software. It was a logical conclusion. The system had been overheating for days, the processors straining under the weight of 1,000 human variables, and finally, the logic had snapped. A software glitch had mapped a horror movie trope onto a weary stranger, a digital hallucination born of a malfunctioning algorithm and his own mounting paranoia. He felt a wave of sheepish relief wash over him, his pulse slowly beginning to settle as he rationalized the nightmare into a series of ones and zeros. Yet, despite the comforting logic of a system error, a cold, nagging curiosity began to gnaw at the edges of his resolve, a dark compulsion to see if the glitch was persistent. With hands that still possessed a faint, uncontrollable tremor, he slowly lifted the glasses back to his face, the frames feeling unnaturally heavy and warm, as if they were pulsing with a life of their own. As the stems slid back into place and the lenses covered his eyes, the roar of the subway was once again sucked into a vacuum of artificial silence. The world regained its razor-sharp edges, the data stream flickering back to life with a series of sharp, clinical chirps. He turned his gaze back toward the edge of the platform, his breath hitching in his throat as the interface locked onto the figure in the beige coat. This time, the glasses did not just label the men, they stripped away the illusion of his humanity with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. Through the violet-tinted lenses, the stranger's skin no longer looked like flesh, but like a translucent, gnarled film of wet parchment that had been stretched too thin over something rotting. Beneath that pale, sickly membrane, a dense, oily mass of black shadows convulsed and writhed, moving with a fluid, serpentine grace that suggested 1,000 hidden limbs. Where his eyes should have been, there were only vast, hollow craters filled with a milky, gelatinous substance that seemed to absorb all light, staring out from the skull with a blind, ancient hunger. The crimson label above his head had expanded, the letters now dripping like fresh blood against the darkness of the tunnel. Demon, Level 5. Feeding on fear. Arthur felt his knees buckle, his legs turning to leaden weights that threatened to drop him onto the grimy floorboards of the station. He tried to look away, but his eyes were held captive by the horrific detail of the creature's true form, the way the black mass underneath its skin seemed to pulse in time with the thumping of his own terrified heart. The entity stood perfectly still, yet Arthur could now see the way the air around it was being distorted, warped by a gravitational pull of pure, concentrated malice. The smell of the station shifted again, the burnt rubber and dust replaced by the cloying, sweet stench of a charnel house in the height of summer, a scent of ancient decay and wet, cooling meat. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his ears as the high-pitched whine of the device reached a fever pitch, vibrating against his brain. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion that felt like it took an eternity to complete, the man in the beige coat began to turn his head toward Arthur. The movement was accompanied by the sound of dry, rusted gears grinding together, a sound that bypassed Arthur's ears and resonated directly within his teeth and jawbone. As the creature's face came into full view, the edges of its mouth began to pull back, stretching the translucent skin until it tore with a series of wet, rhythmic pops. It wasn't a human smile, but a jagged opening that revealed rows of needle-thin, obsidian teeth dripping with a thick, colorless ichor. The milky eyes didn't move, yet Arthur felt a direct, invasive connection established between them, a cold probe of intelligence that began to sift through his most private terrors. The sound that followed was not one of the city or of the subway, but a psychic intrusion that felt like a wet hand reaching into Arthur's skull and squeezing his gray matter. It was the sound of 1,000 knives being drawn across a damp, raw hide, a wet and rhythmic munching of something being consumed from the inside out. Within the silence of the noise-canceling field, the sound of tearing flesh and snapping gristle was the only reality, a wet, sloppy cacophony that celebrated the act of predation. The creature's smile widened, the corners of its mouth reaching back toward its ears, and Arthur realized with a jolt of pure, white-hot horror that it wasn't just observing him. It was savoring him, tasting the chemical tang of his terror as if it were a fine wine, its entire being vibrating with a dark, gluttonous satisfaction. Arthur's hand flew to his mouth to stifle a scream that died in his throat, his eyes wide and fixed on the red text that continued to pulse with a predatory hunger. The train arrived at the station, its massive steel bulk sliding between him and the creature like a heavy, protective curtain, yet the image remained burned into his retinas. Even as the doors hissed open and the crowd began to surge forward, he remained paralyzed against the pillar, his mind reeling from the realization that the world he thought he knew was merely a thin, fragile mask. The glasses had not just given him data, they had given him a window into a hidden ecosystem of nightmares that walked among the living, unnoticed and unchallenged. He stayed there, shivering in the artificial silence, as the creature in the beige coat stepped onto the train and vanished into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving only the lingering, metallic taste of fear on Arthur's tongue. Arthur burst from the mouth of the subway station like a panicked animal fleeing a burning thicket, his lungs burning with the sudden intake of freezing, oxygen-thin air. Above him, the sky had completely surrendered to a violent, icy storm that transformed the autumn drizzle into a barrage of frozen needles. Each drop of water that struck the asphalt did not splash with the gentle, liquid grace of rain, but instead landed with a sharp, percussive click that resonated through the soles of his boots. Through the violet-tinted lenses of the device, the sound was amplified and distorted, turning the downpour into the frantic, rhythmic tapping of 10,000 tiny, chitinous claws scratching against the skin of the world. He stood huddled beneath the concrete overhang of the exit, his chest heaving in jagged, visible plumes of white vapor that vanished into the swirling gray mist of the street. The thought of removing the glasses flickered through his mind like a dying ember, but the muscle memory of his hands refused to obey the impulse, his fingers locking onto the burning stems with a white-knuckled grip. A paralyzing, primordial fear had taken root in the core of his being, a terrifying realization that to remove the filter was to become blind in a room full of hungry predators. Without the glasses, he would see only the comforting, deceptive mask of the city, oblivious to the jagged teeth and reaching hands that now lurked in the spaces between heartbeats. With them, he was a witness to a landscape of absolute damnation, a spectator at a banquet where he was the primary course. The device hummed against his temples, a low-frequency vibration that felt like a swarm of insects burrowing into his parietal lobes, anchoring his soul to the horrific clarity of the digital feed. He forced his leaden legs to move, stepping out from the shelter and into the churning tide of the evening rush hour, but the crowd he encountered was no longer comprised of weary commuters and late-night shoppers. Before him stretched a carnival of the grotesque, a slow-moving parade of entities that wore human skin like ill-fitting, threadbare costumes. A young woman stood just a few feet away, leaning against a brick wall while she laughed into her smartphone, her voice a pleasant, melodic sound that should have been comforting. Above her head, however, the glasses projected a flickering, emerald-green label, Succubus, Carrier of Larvae. As she smiled, her jaw unhinged with a wet, grinding sound, revealing a throat that pulsed with a cluster of pale, translucent sacs that rippled with the movement of something squirming and hungry beneath the surface. Further down the block, an elderly man sat upon a park bench, his hands mechanically tearing pieces of gray bread to scatter for the pigeons that flocked at his feet. In the unaugmented world, he was a picture of grandfatherly benevolence, but through the lenses, he was a monument to silent, predatory observation. The label above him burned with a cold, sapphire light, Watcher, Class 3. His eyes were not eyes at all, but multifaceted, obsidian spheres that rotated independently in their sockets, capturing every flicker of movement in a 360-degree arc. The pigeons that surrounded him were not birds, but extensions of his own gray, withered flesh, tethered to his torso by thin, pulsing cords of gristle that hummed with a low-voltage electrical current. As Arthur stumbled forward, his gaze drifted upward, and the very architecture of the city seemed to undergo a sickening, organic metamorphosis. The skyscrapers that had once stood as triumphs of steel and glass were now revealed to be massive, cyclopean pillars of compressed bone, their surfaces etched with the calcified remains of a billion forgotten lives. He could see the rhythmic, sluggish thrumming of immense, blue veins that ran beneath the concrete of the facades, carrying a thick, bioluminescent ichor to the upper reaches of the structures. The windows were no longer apertures for light, but rows of weeping, lidless eyes that blinked in slow, agonizing unison, their pupils tracking his frantic progress through the veins of the urban beast. The infrastructure of the street itself had become a complex network of anatomical horrors, a web of biological machinery that sustained the hidden ecosystem of the city. Telephone wires and power lines draped between the buildings like sagging, translucent tendons, vibrating with the passage of a dark, humming energy that sounded like a million distant screams. Every street lamp was a glowing, fibrous polyp that exhaled a faint, sickly sweet gas into the frigid air, a scent of rotting lilies and ozone that clung to the back of Arthur's throat. He felt a wave of intense nausea wash over him as he realized the ground beneath his feet was not solid earth, but a layer of thick, keratinized hide that groaned under the weight of the traffic, a living floor that exhaled a warm, humid draft from the sewer grates. The auditory world had undergone the most terrifying transformation of all, as the noise-canceling software finally stripped away the last vestiges of human sound. The hum of engines, the splash of tires on wet pavement, and the distant sirens were gone, replaced by the internal, wet acoustics of a gargantuan, digesting womb. He heard the deep, cavernous gurgling of gastric fluids moving through the pipes beneath the street, the wet slap of peristalsis echoing from the alleyways, and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a heart the size of a city block. It was a sound of absolute, mindless consumption, the noise of a universe that existed only to feed, to break down, and to incorporate everything into its own vast, suffocating mass. In his desperate attempt to navigate the sidewalk, Arthur's shoulder brushed against a man in a sharp, charcoal-gray suit who was hurrying in the opposite direction. In his ears, the device did not register the soft thud of fabric against fabric, but instead generated the sickening, high-fidelity sound of a butcher's knife being driven into a side of raw, hanging meat. The sound was accompanied by a visceral, wet squelch that made Arthur's stomach lurch, his mind conjuring the image of a blade parting muscle and sinew with effortless precision. He recoiled from the contact, his hand flying to his own shoulder as if expecting to find a gaping wound, but there was only the cold, damp wool of his coat. The man in the suit didn't even turn his head, his label flickering with the words Harvester, Level 9, as he vanished into the gray gloom of the storm. Every subsequent contact was a fresh assault on his sanity, a cacophony of stabs, slashes, and bone-deep punctures that turned the simple act of walking into a gauntlet of phantom violence. He stumbled into a teenager on a bicycle, and the sound of the collision was the sound of a heavy iron mallet crushing a human ribcage, a dry, splintering crack that resonated through Arthur's own chest. He grazed the arm of a woman pushing a stroller, and the resulting noise was the rasping slide of a serrated saw through wet timber. The air around him was thick with the mental projections of the entities he passed, a low-frequency static of predatory intent, a series of guttural hisses and wet, clicking thoughts that bypassed his linguistic centers and spoke directly to his amygdala. Arthur felt his grasp on reality beginning to fray and tear like an old, sun-rotted piece of silk stretched over a jagged frame. The internal monologue that had sustained him for 34 years was being drowned out by the external, digital noise, his sense of self eroding under the pressure of the horrific truth he was now forced to inhabit. He was no longer a man named Arthur, he was a trembling, biological anomaly in a world of monsters, a glitch in a system that was designed to consume. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to shove them deep into his pockets to keep from crying out, his fingernails digging into his palms until he felt the warm, metallic trickle of blood. The labels continued to scroll across his vision in a never-ending stream of red and violet, infector, drone, parasite, seeder, each word a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his mind. He reached the corner of his own street, his vision swimming with iridescent patches of static and the ghostly afterimages of the things he had seen. The streetlights above him flickered with a rhythmic, dying pulse, their sapphire light casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the ground and reach for his ankles. He could hear his own breathing now, a frantic, wet rasping that sounded exactly like the sounds of the creatures around him, a realization that sent a fresh jolt of white-hot terror through his nerves. He was becoming part of the soundscape, his fear providing the high-pitched harmonic that the city needed to complete its predatory symphony. He began to run, his boots slipping on the slick, keratinous pavement, his eyes fixed on the distant, bone-white silhouette of his apartment building, which loomed in the darkness like a giant, hollowed-out tooth waiting to swallow him whole. Arthur threw his entire weight against the heavy oak of his front door, the wood groaning in protest before the frame met the jamb with a thunderous, final thud that vibrated through his entire skeleton. His fingers, slick with cold rain and a fine, uncontrollable tremor, fumbled blindly for the security locks, turning the 3 heavy brass cylinders until they clicked into place with a series of sharp, mechanical barks. He leaned his forehead against the cold surface of the door, listening to the muffled roar of the storm outside being strangled by the thick walls of his apartment. In this small, rectangular fortress, surrounded by the familiar objects of his mundane life, he expected to find a sanctuary of silence, but the air inside was thick and stagnant, smelling of old dust, stale coffee, and a new, metallic scent that stung the back of his throat like copper. His chest rose and fell in jagged, uneven heaves, his breath catching in his throat in a series of wet, pathetic wimps that echoed off the narrow walls of the foyer. Despite the relative safety of his home, he made no move to reach for the frames of the glasses, his hands remaining clenched at his sides as if pinned there by an invisible force. A deep, instinctual terror had convinced him that the device was no longer merely showing him the world, but was instead the only thing keeping the predatory shadows at bay through the act of observation. He feared that if he were to strip the lenses away, the monsters would not vanish with the digital feed, but would instead simply become invisible, leaving him to be torn apart by things he could no longer see coming. He slid slowly down the length of the door, the wet wool of his coat rasping against the wood like sandpaper, until his buttocks hit the floor with a dull, heavy jar. He sat there in the dimness, his knees pulled tight against his chest, staring into the darkened hallway where the shadows seemed to pulse in a rhythmic, sluggish dance. The apartment, which had been his retreat for 7 years, now greeted him as an alien landscape of biological and technological horror, rendered in terrifying detail by the violet-tinted lenses. The walls, once covered in a simple, cream-colored wallpaper, were now revealed to be a complex lattice of heaving, organic matter, as if the plaster had been replaced by a thin, translucent layer of skin. He watched with a sickening fascination as faint, pulsating patterns began to emerge beneath the surface, a network of blue and purple capillaries that throbbed with the passage of some unseen, viscous fluid. The texture was uneven and diseased, covered in a fine, glistening rash of microscopic pores that exhaled a faint, humid mist into the room. Every inch of his home was alive, a dormant, breathing entity that had been masquerading as architecture while it waited for him to finally see it. His gaze drifted toward the kitchen, and the interface responded with a sharp, electronic chirp that felt like a needle being driven into his ear canal. Above the refrigerator, a glowing, crimson label materialized, the text shivering with a frantic, internal energy, biomass storage. He could hear the low, mechanical hum of the appliance's motor, but through the bone conduction of the glasses, the sound was transformed into a deep, guttural growl of a digestive tract at rest. The white enamel surface of the fridge looked like a polished, calcified tooth, and he could smell the faint, cloying scent of Freon mixed with the unmistakable odor of raw, cooling meat seeping through the door seals. The kitchen was no longer a place of nourishment, but a station for the preservation of organic waste, a cold chamber for the materials of a larger, unseen hunger. Turning his head slowly toward the living room, he saw the television set sitting on its stand like a hollowed-out skull, its black screen reflecting the distorted, violet-tinged image of the room. Above the device, a label burned with a cold, sapphire light, obedience emitter. Even in its powered-down state, the TV seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency static that set Arthur's teeth on edge, a sound like 1,000 distant whispers chanting in a language he couldn't quite understand. The dust motes dancing in the dim light of the hallway were no longer harmless particles of skin and fabric, but were identified by the glasses as airborne spores, each one a tiny, floating node of surveillance that drifted toward him with a deliberate, haunting slowness. He felt a sudden, sharp prickling sensation on his arms, as if the air itself were trying to graft itself onto his exposed skin. As he sat on the floor, the physical sensation of the glasses began to change, the weight of the frames increasing until it felt as though he were wearing a helmet made of lead. A searing, rhythmic heat began to radiate from the temples, a deep and invasive warmth that seemed to bypass his skin and sink directly into the bone of his skull. He felt a series of tiny, needle-like pressures along his jawline and behind his ears, a sensation that felt disturbingly like thin, metallic roots or wires slowly boring through his flesh to seek out his nervous system. The sound in his head had evolved from a hum into a constant, crushing pressure, a physical weight that pressed against his brain from the inside out, making his vision flicker with bursts of white, blinding static. It felt as if the device were no longer a tool he was using, but a parasite that was finishing the process of its final, permanent integration into his body. Unable to remain still under the mounting pressure of his own home, Arthur began to crawl toward the bathroom, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate, like those of a man moving through deep, viscous mud. He moved on his hands and knees, the fibers of the hallway carpet feeling like coarse, damp hair beneath his palms, a texture that made him recoil with every forward surge. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, terrified of what labels might bloom over the doors to the rooms he was passing, terrified of the labels that might define his own bedroom. The air in the hallway was thick with the sound of his own heart, which pounded with a heavy, wet thud that the glasses amplified until it sounded like a drum being struck inside a cavern. He could taste the metallic tang of his own fear, a sharp, electric bitterness that coated his tongue and made it difficult to swallow. It was then that he heard the first sound from behind the walls, a faint, rhythmic scratching that seemed to originate from the very heart of the building's structure. It wasn't the sound of mice or the settling of old pipes, but the distinct, deliberate sound of sharp, chitinous claws dragging across concrete and wood. At first, he tried to tell himself it was merely his neighbors in the adjacent apartment, perhaps moving furniture or walking across their own floors, but the glasses offered no such comfort. As he focused on the sound, the interface projected a series of rhythmic, red pulses through the walls, mapping the movement of entities that moved with a terrifying, multi-legged grace. The labels flickered in the periphery of his vision, pale and jagged, the hive. The sound of the scratching intensified, becoming a frantic, starving scrabble as if the things on the other side of the plaster knew he was there, knew that he could finally see them. The noise of the hive was a cacophony of wet clicks, dry rasps, and low, vibrating hisses that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and into Arthur's very bones. He could hear them moving through the joists, their heavy, bloated bodies squeezing through the narrow spaces between the floors, their claws leaving deep, invisible gouges in the structural supports of his home. They were not just living in the walls, they were the walls, part of the living architecture that had finally decided to acknowledge his presence. The system in his head began to issue a series of high-priority alerts, the text flashing so rapidly that he could only catch fragments of the warnings: structural integrity compromised, predatory proximity critical, visual breach detected. Every red flash in his vision felt like a physical blow to his equilibrium, a strobe light of impending doom that turned the hallway into a fractured, nightmare landscape. He finally reached the bathroom door and threw himself inside, his hands scrambling for the light switch as he slammed the door shut and engaged the small, flimsy privacy bolt. The room was small, windowless, and lined with cold, white tiles that offered a stark, clinical contrast to the organic horror of the hallway. He slumped against the bathtub, his breath coming in short, agonizing gasps that sounded like a saw being pulled through bone. The air here was colder, smelling of bleach and mildew, a scent that felt momentarily clean compared to the cloying, sweet decay of the rest of the apartment. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the interface remained, burned onto the back of his eyelids in a series of glowing, persistent lines of code that refused to fade into the darkness. Even here, in the supposed isolation of the bathroom, the sound of the hive did not diminish. Instead, it became more focused, a concentrated scratching that seemed to be coming from directly behind the mirror and from within the drain of the sink. He could hear the wet, sucking sound of something moving through the pipes, a rhythmic gurgling that mimicked the sound of a human throat being constricted. The tiles beneath him felt unnervingly soft, as if they were merely a thin, ceramic shell over a layer of yielding muscle. He looked up at the ceiling, and the glasses highlighted a series of hairline fractures in the plaster, labeling them as exit points for the emerging swarm. He was trapped in a box of bone and skin, a small, white cell where the walls were beginning to sing with the hunger of the things that had lived beside him in silence for years. The pressure in his temples reached a crescendo, a blinding, white-hot agony that made him scream, though no sound escaped his paralyzed throat. He could feel the metallic roots of the glasses twining around his optic nerves, pulling tight until his vision was nothing but a sea of screaming, crimson data. The interface was no longer providing information, it was a hysterical, looping broadcast of a single, terrifying truth that he could no longer escape. He reached up, his fingers finally touching the frames with the intent to tear them off, but as his skin made contact with the warm, pulsing material, he realized with a jolt of absolute despair that he could no longer tell where the plastic ended and his own flesh began. He was the device, and the device was him, a single, unified sensor for the suffering of a world that was currently breaking through the walls to reclaim its own. Arthur pushed his palms against the cold, unyielding ceramic of the bathroom floor, his joints popping with the sound of dry twigs snapping under a heavy tread. The tiles were slick with a thin, greasy film of condensation and the lingering dampness of his own frantic movements, feeling like the scales of a cold-blooded predator against his skin. His legs trembled with a violent, rhythmic instability, the muscles in his thighs twitching as if trying to detach themselves from the bone beneath. Every movement was a monumental struggle against a gravity that seemed to have doubled in intensity, pulling at his organs and dragging his spirit toward the dark, weeping grout between the tiles. He finally managed to steady himself against the porcelain rim of the sink, his fingernails scraping against the smooth surface with a high-pitched, agonizing screech that resonated through his jawbone. Above his head, the single, naked light bulb encased in its frosted glass shroud flickered with a dying, spasmodic energy. It emitted a low, constant buzz that mimicked the sound of a bloated fly trapped behind a windowpane, a sound that rose and fell in pitch with the erratic flow of the current. The light it cast was sickly and jaundiced, turning the white tiles into the color of aged parchment and deepening the shadows in the corners of the room until they looked like pools of spilled ink. Arthur could smell the sharp, chemical tang of the cleaning fluids he had used weeks ago, now mingled with the sour, metallic scent of his own cold sweat and the underlying odor of wet stone. The air in the small, windowless space was stagnant and heavy, vibrating with the same unnatural frequency that had been boring into his skull since he first put on the device. He forced his head upward, his neck muscles straining against the weight of the frames that now felt like an integral part of his skeletal structure. The mirror above the sink was a landscape of neglect, its surface obscured by a chaotic map of dried water spots, gray dust, and tiny, white flecks of hardened toothpaste that looked like distant, frozen stars. As his gaze locked onto the glass, the interface of the glasses didn't just highlight the physical world, it began to project a shimmering, translucent grid of coordinates directly onto the reflective surface. The lines were a pale, electric violet, intersecting and bifurcating with mathematical cruelty, measuring the distance between his pupils and the silvered back of the mirror with terrifying precision. He watched as the numbers scrolled vertically in his periphery, a waterfall of data that seemed to be calculating the exact moment of his total dissolution. The reflection that stared back at him was that of a stranger, a hollowed-out husk of a man whose skin had been drained of all warmth and vitality. His face was a mask of pale, waxy flesh, stretched tight over the sharp protrusions of his cheekbones and the jagged line of his jaw. Deep, cavernous shadows had gathered in the hollows beneath his eyes, turning his sockets into dark, bottomless pits that seemed to lead into another dimension. His hair was matted with sweat and rain, clinging to his forehead like dark, wet weeds. Yet, it was what the glasses showed him beyond the flesh that froze the marrow in his bones. The device was no longer just labeling the room, it was peeling back the layers of his very soul, exposing the raw, digital architecture of his existence. Around his head, suspended in the stagnant air of the bathroom, there hung a glowing, flickering crown of light that pulsed with a jagged, unstable frequency. It was not the soft, ethereal halo of a saint, but a violent ring of corrupted information, a halo of broken pixels, bleeding colors, and digital noise that hissed as it rotated. The light was a sickly, neon white, casting harsh, flickering glares against the dirty mirror and illuminating the microscopic pores of his skin with clinical brutality. He watched as the pixels detached themselves from the ring and drifted downward like radioactive snow, vanishing before they touched his shoulders. The bone conduction hum in his head shifted, the low-frequency purr suddenly replaced by the piercing, agonizing shriek of a circular saw biting into a sheet of rusted steel. The sound was a physical assault, a high-velocity vibration that made his vision blur and his teeth ache with a cold, electric pain. As the shriek reached its crescendo, the interface flared with a blinding, white-hot intensity that seemed to burn through his retinas and etch itself directly onto the surface of his brain. The letters materialized in the center of his field of vision, hovering over his forehead in the mirror with a final, absolute authority. Prophet, the top line read, the font jagged and ancient. Beneath it, the text scrolled with a cold, algorithmic certainty, threat to the system. Sublabel, subject is aware. Final directive, to be destroyed. The white light of the words was so bright that it washed out the rest of the room, leaving Arthur standing in a void of pure, terrifying information. Then, as if a master switch had been thrown in the heart of the universe, the sound vanished. The shriek of the saw, the hum of the light bulb, and the frantic thumping of his own heart were all swallowed by an absolute, suffocating silence. It was a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight, a layer of cold, damp cotton wrapped tightly around his head. He remained frozen against the sink, his hands still gripping the porcelain with such force that his knuckles had turned the color of bone. In this vacuum of sound, his other senses became preternaturally sharp. He could feel the microscopic vibrations of the building, the slow, tectonic groan of the foundation, and the cold, thin draft that began to seep through the gap beneath the bathroom door. It was within this total, airless silence that he heard the sound of his front door. The heavy oak portal, which he had locked with 3 separate, mechanical turns of the brass bolts, groaned on its hinges. He heard the distinct, metallic click of the locks disengaging one by one, a sound that shouldn't have been possible without a key and a hand to turn it. Then came the long, slow screech of the door opening, the sound of wood dragging against the floorboards as the vacuum of the apartment was finally breached. A new scent began to drift down the hallway and into the bathroom, cutting through the smell of bleach, the scent of old ozone, scorched earth, and the icy, breathless cold of the void between the stars. The footsteps began a moment later, echoing through the empty apartment with a rhythmic, terrifying clarity. They were not the soft, muffled thuds of rubber soles on wood, nor the sharp, confident clack of a man's dress shoes. Instead, each step landed with the heavy, hollow resonance of a hoof striking the parquet. The sound was cloven and sharp, a series of rhythmic clicks and thuds that suggested a weight far greater than that of any human being. As the intruder moved down the hallway, the floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned and splintered under the pressure, the sound of breaking timber echoing like distant gunfire in the silence. The entity was moving toward the bathroom with a slow, deliberate pace, a predator that knew its prey was cornered and had nowhere left to run. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the mirror, his pupils dilated until the iris was nothing more than a thin, trembling sliver of color. Behind the reflection of his own shoulder, out in the darkness of the hallway that was visible through the cracked-open bathroom door, a new shape began to coalesce. It was a tall, spindly shadow that seemed to swallow the light around it, a silhouette that defied the geometric logic of the walls. As the figure stepped into the periphery of the doorframe, the glasses hummed with a final, desperate surge of energy. A new label erupted in the glass, pulsing with a deep, bruised violet light that seemed to bleed into the surrounding air. Liquidator. Level, Infinity. The text was accompanied by a series of scrolling runes that looked like a fusion of ancient hieroglyphs and machine code, a language of pure, unadulterated termination. The temperature in the bathroom plummeted, his breath suddenly visible as a thick, swirling fog that obscured the coordinate grid on the mirror. The frost began to bloom across the edges of the glass, the ice crystals growing in jagged, dendritic patterns that looked like reaching fingers. He could hear the intruder now, standing just on the other side of the thin, wooden bathroom door. There was no sound of breathing, only the low, metallic hum of a machine at idle and the faint, wet sound of something shifting beneath a heavy, unseen garment. The door began to vibrate in its frame, the wood groaning as the pressure from the other side increased, a slow and steady force that treated the privacy bolt as if it were made of nothing more than brittle sugar. Arthur opened his mouth to scream, to let out the primal, guttural cry of a creature facing its end, but the device reacted with a terrifying, preemptive speed. The stems of the glasses, which had already begun to fuse with his temples, suddenly tightened with a mechanical, bone-crushing force. He felt the cold, hard material bite deep into his flesh, the pressure mounting until he heard the faint, sickening crack of his own temporal bones beginning to give way. His jaw was locked into a rigid, agonizing spasm, the muscles corded and frozen, preventing even a single gasp from escaping his lips. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike driven through the center of his consciousness, eclipsing the fear and the cold and the sound of the door finally splintering inward. As the wood of the bathroom door gave way, shattering into 1,000 white shards of splinters, the entity stepped into the jaundiced light of the room. It was a towering, multifaceted horror of shifting plates and dark, oily smoke, a creature that existed in more dimensions than the human eye could process. Arthur's vision began to fracture, the coordinate grid on the mirror breaking apart into a chaotic storm of red and white light. The last thing the glasses showed him was a final, scrolling line of text that filled his entire field of vision, a message that seemed to be a mercy and a curse all at once. End of stream, the letters read. Data purge initiated. Then, the burning heat in his temples reached a terminal intensity, and the jaundiced light of the bathroom was extinguished by a deep, hollow blackness that tasted of copper and the cold, silent end of the world.